Section 63 of The Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 63. Captain O'Blunderbuss. Captain O'Blunderbuss was a gentleman of Irish extraction, and, according to his own account, possessed of vast estates in the Emerald Island. But it was evident to all his friends that the rents were very irregularly paid, inasmuch as their gallant proprietor was frequently under the necessity of soliciting the loan of a guinea, and when he could not obtain that sum, his demand would suddenly drop to half-a-crown, or even 18 pence. But whenever the captain talked of his estates, no one ventured to suggest a doubt relative to their existence, for the gallant officer was a notorious duellist, having been engaged as principal in 37 of those pleasant little contests, and as second in 92 more. He was about 45 years of age, and of exceedingly fierce appearance. His crown was entirely bald, but huge bushes of red hair stuck out between his temples and his ears. Enormous whiskers of the same meteoric hue and portent covered half his face, and a formidable pair of moustaches, red also, curled ominously over his upper lip, the ends being twisted and greased so as to look like two small tails. In person he was tall, thin, but not ill-made. He held himself particularly upright, and as he wore a military undress coat, all frogged and braided in the Polish fashion, and grey trousers with red stripes down the legs, he really looked like what he called himself, and was called by others, namely, a captain. But he was not wont to be more explicit relative to his military services than he was definite concerning the locality of his estates. No one knew, and assuredly no one ever ventured to ask him, to what regiment he had belonged. He stated himself to be unattached, and that was sufficient. We should, as faithful chroniclers, observe that it had been whispered, but then scandal is so rife in this wicked world, that Captain O'Blunderbuss was never in the army at all, and that his formidable name was merely an assumed one, and the newsmongers who propagated these reports behind the gallant gentleman's back not only ridiculed the idea of his estates, but actually carried their malignant spite so far as to insinuate that he was once the driver of a jaunting car in Dublin, and at that period bore the name of Teddy O'Flaherty. Be all this as it may, it is nevertheless very certain that Captain O'Blunderbuss was a great man about town, that he was nodded to by loungers in the park, shaken hands with by dandies in Bond Street, and invariably chosen as a second in every duel that took place on Wormwood Scrubs, Wimbledon Common, or Battersea Fields. Such was the terrible individual who was standing on the rug, in a most ferocious attitude, when Sir Christopher Blunt entered the drawing-room. The captain desisted from twirling his moustaches, and indulged in a good long stare at the knight, whose half-ludicrous, half-doleful appearance was certainly remarkable enough to attract an unusual degree of attention. "You received my card, Sir Christopher Blunt," said the captain, speaking in a strong Irish accent, and rattling the R in a truly menacing manner. "Yes, sir, I received the card of Captain Blunderbuss," replied Sir Christopher, not knowing what to think or make of his strange visitor. "And sure I'm Captain Blunderbuss," exclaimed the military gentleman, twirling his moustache, "and I've come on the part of my friend Captain Morthaunt. An honourable man, Sir Christopher Blunt," added the gentleman emphatically, looking awfully fierce at the same time, just as if the unfortunate knight entertained the idea of questioning the honour of Captain Mordaunt. "I've no doubt of it, sir," stammered the intimidated Blunt, looking more wretched in proportion as the tone of his visitor became more excited. "By the powers, I'm glad you don't doubt it," cried the captain, "or you'd find yourself deceived in your man. Well, Sir Christopher, the short and the long of the affair is just this. My friend Captain Mordaunt feels himself aggrieved on behalf of his sister, and he's put the little business into my hands to manage for him." "I'm convinced that Captain Mordaunt could not have chosen a better friend, Captain O'Blunderbuss," said the knight, scarcely able to utter a word, so sorely was he oppressed by vague alarms. "But I hope, that is, I mean, in a word——" "What do you mean?" demanded the captain, advancing a pace or two towards the knight. "Oh, nothing, only—" stammered Sir Christopher, dodging round the table for fear that the formidable O'Blunderbuss intended an attack upon him. "Only what, man?" vociferated the captain. "Sure now, you don't think I'm after ating ye up?" "No, oh no, I'm not afraid of any gentleman eating me exactly," observed Sir Christopher; "but if you would state the object of your visit——" "Be Jasus, and that's soon done!" exclaimed Captain O'Blunderbuss. "The short facts is these: Captain Mordaunt is mightily attached to his sister, Miss Julia, who's a most amiable lady, for I've just been breakfasting with her and her brother in their lodgings in Half Moon Street. Miss Mordaunt, as perhaps you are aware, returned home to her father's mansion, a sweet place, by the by, in Connemara, when you deceived her in the most gross, the most infamous manner, by running away with a lady's maid instead of her dear self." "Captain O'Blunderbuss," said Sir Christopher, "she of whom you speak is now Lady Blunt." "And much good may she do ye, Sir Christopher!" exclaimed the captain. "But, as I was saying, Miss Mordaunt comes back to London again, smarting under the influence of her wrongs, which her brother has resolved to avenge. And therefore, Sir Christopher, you'll be so good as just to say whether it shall be on Wormwood Scrubs or Wimbledon Common, and we'll be there punctual to-morrow morning at 8 o'clock." The worthy knight looked perfectly aghast. He began to understand the real drift of Captain O'Blunderbuss's visit, and he entertained the most unmitigated abhorrence of the mere idea of a duel. "Well, Sir Christopher, say the word," resumed the gallant gentleman, with as much unconcern as if he were making arrangements for a party of pleasure. "But perhaps you'd like to consult a friend, or refer me to him. That's the best way. Leave it to your friend and me, and we'll settle everything so comfortable that you'll not have the least trouble in the world. You can get your breakfast a trifle earlier than usual." "Breakfast!" echoed Sir Christopher, in a deep sepulchral tone. "Breakfast, when one is going out to be shot at!" "Be the powers, and why not?" demanded the warlike captain. "But here we are, wasting our precious time, while we ought to be settling the little business and trying the pistols at the gallery." "The pistols!" groaned Sir Christopher, his visage lengthening most awfully, and his under jaw completely dropping through intense alarm. "Be Jasus, and what would you fight with if it isn't pistols?" cried the captain. "But pistols are so apt to kill people," observed the knight, shaking from head to foot. "Is it afraid you are?" demanded Captain O'Blunderbuss, twirling his moustache as he surveyed Sir Christopher with cool contempt. "I do not admit such an imputation," answered the knight; "but I will not fight with this madcap Mordaunt. The law shall be my protection. I am my own master. I married whom I chose, and I will not be bullied by any man living." The astonishment depicted on the countenance of Captain O'Blunderbuss, as these words met his ears, was mistaken by the knight for a feeling of apprehension. and thus he had grown bold, or at least energetic in his language, as he had proceeded. "Yes, sir," he added emphatically, "the law shall protect me." "Is it shirking that ye mane?" asked the captain; "because if it is, I shall feel myself bound to administer a decent drubbing to you, Sir Christopher. Why, sir, it's a rale insult to me to refuse to fight with my friend." And as he uttered these words, the captain advanced in a menacing fashion towards the knight. "Keep off, sir! Don't attempt violence against me!" exclaimed Sir Christopher Blunt, rushing towards the fireplace to seize the poker. "I'll not stand it, Captain O'Blunderbuss. I have been a sheriff in my time. I once put up for the Portsoken, and I'll not submit to any insult." "Then name your friend, sir," thundered the gallant officer, "or I'll not lave a whole bone on your skin." "Well, I will," ejaculated Sir Christopher, anxious to get rid of his fire-eating visitor on any terms. "Go to my nephew, Mr. Frank Curtis. He has killed his man often enough, according to his own account." "Be the powers, that just suits me to a tay!" exclaimed the captain; "for may be he and me could just amuse ourselves with an exchange of shots after you and my friend Morthaunt have settled your own small trifle. 'Twould be a perfect godsend to me, and I've no doubt your nevy will be of the same mind. Where does he hang out?" Sir Christopher hastily mentioned the address of Mr. Frank Curtis, and Captain O'Blunderbuss stalked away, hugely delighted at the idea of being about to form the acquaintance of a gentleman every way so worthy of his friendship as the knight's nephew appeared to be. Fierce indeed was the aspect of Captain O'Blunderbuss as he marched through the streets to the address indicated by the knight; and to the great joy of the military gentleman, he found on his arrival that Mr. Frank Curtis was at home. "But he's not up yet, sir," said the spruce-looking tiger who opened the front door, at which the captain had given one of his tremendous double knocks. "Never mind, my boy," exclaimed the visitor in an awe-inspiring tone. "Your master will be glad to see me, or I'm mightily desaved." "What name shall I say, sir?" inquired the tiger. "Faith, and I'll just take my name up along with me, my lad," returned the captain. "Which floor may it be now?" "First floor, sir, and the bedroom's at the back." "Be Jasus, you're a smart lad, and a credit to your master!" exclaimed the captain. "The next time I come, I'll make ye a present of sixpence." And with these words, Captain O'Blunderbuss marched upstairs. On reaching the landing, he knocked at the back room door with his fist, as if he were practising how to fell an ox; and to this peremptory summons an invitation to "come in" was returned. The captain accordingly stalked into the chamber, where Mr. Frank Curtis was breakfasting in bed, a table well spread being drawn up close by the side of his couch. "Be Jasus, I knew you was a boy after my own heart!" ejaculated the captain, as he caught sight of a bottle of whisky which stood near the teapot. Then, closing the door, he advanced up to the bed, and pulling off his buckskin glove, said, "Mr. Curtis, here's my hand. Tip us yours, my boy, and let's know each other without any more potter." Mr. Frank Curtis accepted the proffered hand with delight, for the amiable deportment of the visitor now relieved his mind from the vague fears that had been excited in it by the unceremonious entry and ferocious appearance of the captain. "And how are ye, Mr. Curtis?" continued this gentleman, drawing a chair close to the bed, and depositing his gloves in his hat, and his hat on the table. "Quite blooming, old fellow, thank ye," returned Frank, to whom all this familiarity was by no means displeasing. "But what will you take? Shall I ring for another cup and plate, or will you take a dram of the whisky?" "The potheen, my boy, the potheen for me," exclaimed the captain, grasping the bottle. "You'll find it rather good, I fancy," said Curtis. "My friend, the Russian ambassador, sent it round last night with his best respects." "And my respects to him and to you both," cried the captain. Then, having drained his glass, he drew a long breath and said, "Be Jesus, that's some of the right sort." "Help yourself then, old fellow," said Frank, in as free and easy a manner as if he had known his visitor all his life. "I can get plenty more where that came from. Old Brandziokowski, the Polish ambassador's butler, has had orders to give me the entire run of his master's cellar, for me and his Excellency are as thick as two thieves. He is pestering me from morning to night to dine with him." "No wonder, Mr. Curtis," interrupted the captain, "for you're the most agreeable gentleman I've the honour to be acquainted with." "And what's your name, old boy?" asked Frank, as he proceeded with his breakfast. "Captain O'Blunderbuss, at your service, my dear friend," was the answer, while the individual who gave it helped himself to another glass of whisky, which was certainly the best that the Stilton cheese round the corner could supply. "Delighted to form your acquaintance, Captain," exclaimed Curtis, suddenly becoming a trifle less familiar, for the name was well known to him, in connexion too with the notoriety of a duellist. "And might I inquire what business——" "Oh, we'll talk about that presently," interrupted the captain. "Your uncle, Sir Christopher Blunt, recommended you to me in the strongest terms—the most flattering terms, I may say." "Indeed!" ejaculated Mr. Curtis with unfeigned surprise, for he had not seen nor spoken to the knight for some weeks. "Be the powers! He gave you a splendid character, Mr. Curtis," cried Captain O'Blunderbuss, "and it was quite longing to know you, I was. But we'll talk on business presently, and I'm in no hurry, and we'll have a cosy chat first. Maybe my name is not altogether strange to you?" "By no means," answered Curtis, now thoroughly convinced that the object of his new friend's visit was altogether of an amicable character. "I have heard of your renown, and I must say that I have envied it, but I've done a little in the same line myself, chiefly in France, though. I'll be bound the name of the Marquis of Soup Maigre is not unknown to you." "Yes, I've heard spake of it," returned the captain, helping himself to another glass of whisky. "Well, the Duke and me fought with small swords for 3 hours one morning," continued Frank, "and at length I managed to scratch the little finger of his left hand. In France, you know, a duel always ends when the first blood is drawn; and so the Count flung away his sword, acknowledged that I'd beat him, and we've been bosom friends ever since." "Give me your hand, my broth of a boy," exclaimed the captain. "I was not deceived in you. You're as fine-spirited as your potheen. Why, be the powers, you're a confirmed duellist." "To be sure, and I have killed my man too," responded Frank, delighted to perceive that he had made a deep impression on his companion. "There was the famous Spaniard, you know. What was his name again? Don Juan Stiletto del Guerilla. He was a dreadful fellow, the terror of all Paris, where he was staying when I was also there. Well, one evening—it was at the King's fancy ball—this Portuguese fellow gave himself such airs that there was no bearing him. He insulted all the gentlemen, and smirked at all the ladies. At length, the Archbishop of Paris, who was in full canonicals, appealed to me to put down the insolent Italian. I undertook the task, and picked a quarrel with him in no time. The ladies all looked upon me as one devoted to death; and though I say it who shouldn't, a great deal of tender sympathy was shown towards me. Well, next morning, me and the German met on the very top of Montmartre, and in a quarter of an hour My gentleman was weltering in his blood. That affair won for me the love of the beautiful Countess of Dunkirk. But she is gone down to the tomb, and I am left behind to mourn her loss." And Mr. Frank Curtis took a large bite of a muffin, doubtless to subdue the sigh which rose to his lips at this sad reminiscence. "Be the holy poker, it's a touching business!" cried the captain, who had by this time fully seen through the mendacious braggadocio of Mr. Frank Curtis, and had come to the conclusion that he was as great a coward in reality as his uncle. But the gallant Captain O'Blunderbuss did not choose to suffer the young gentleman to perceive that he understood him, as the whisky was too much to his taste to allow him to lose the chance of emptying the bottle by a too precipitate rupture. Frank, firmly believing that all his fine stories were taken as gospel by his visitor, rattled away in his usual style, heaping lie upon lie at such a rate that, had his falsehoods been mountains, the piling thereof would have outdone the feats of Titan with Ossa and Pelion. At length the captain began to thrust in a few words edgeways, as the contents of the bottle got lower and lower. "Your uncle, Mr. Curtis, seems a nice old gentleman. His face was rarely plastered this morning, as if he'd been in the wars a trifle or so." "Perhaps his wife had been giving him a taste of her claws," said Frank, with a coarse giggle. "Be St. Patrick! And that's just what struck me," exclaimed the captain. "She's a very devil, I know," continued Frank. "But I say, old fellow, what little business was it that took you to old Sir Christopher's and made him refer you to me?" "Is it the little business?" cried the captain. "Och, and be Jasus, then it's just that affair of my friend Morthaunt, who manes to shoot Sir Christopher to-morrow morning before breakfast." "Shoot Sir Christopher!" ejaculated Frank, apparently more surprised than annoyed. "Or else just get shot himself, be the powers," added Captain Blunderbuss. "And because it's myself that's Morthaunt's friend, Sir Christopher has referred me to you as his friend." "Then it's a regular duel?" asked Frank, opening his eyes wider and wider. "The purtiest little affair I ever had a finger in, Mr. Curtis," responded the captain, now looking tremendously fierce, for although he had imbibed at least a pint of pure spirit without experiencing the least inconvenience in respect to his brain, the effects were nevertheless apparent in an awful rubicundity of countenance. "The purtiest little affair, certainly," he continued, "and it now only remains for you and me just to settle the place, time being, of course, in the morning at 8. "And do you mean to say that my old uncle has agreed to fight this duel with Captain Mordaunt?" inquired Frank. "Be Jasus, it's for you to bring him to the scratch, Mr. Curtis, or else——" "Or else what?" demanded the young gentleman, oppressed by a vague presentiment of evil. "Or else, be the holy poker, you must fight me," returned Captain O'Blunderbuss, twirling his moustache in the coolest and calmest manner possible. "Fight you!" ejaculated Frank, turning ashy pale. "As a matter of course," answered the captain. "A famous duellist like Mr. Curtis can't be at a loss on a point of honour." "But why the devil should I fight you?" demanded the young gentleman, his heart palpitating audibly. "Why the devil shouldn't you?" vociferated Captain O'Blunderbuss. "Answer me that, my friend." "My dear sir, it's really—I mean you—that is to say, I think, with all due deference," stammered Frank, growing every moment more and more alarmed. "Be Jasus, I've said nothing I don't mane to stick to!" exclaimed the martial gentleman, now assuming an expression of countenance so fierce that Frank Curtis began to have serious misgivings that his visitor intended to assault him then and there. "But, my dear Captain, this proceeding," said Frank, assuming a tone of excruciating politeness, "is going on beautifully, Mr. Curtis; and so, as you seem to have a little delicacy in putting yourself too forward in the matter," continued the Captain, "we'll just say Battersea Fields to-morrow morning at 8 o'clock. Good-bye, Mr. Curtis." With these words the Captain took up his hat, and stalked majestically out of the room, banging the door violently after him. Frank Curtis fell back in his bed, and gave vent to his feelings in a deep groan. The door opened again with a crash, and the Captain thrust in his inflamed visage, exclaiming, "You'll remember, Mr. Curtis, that I should be responsible in this matter, and that if you can't bring the uncle to the scratch, you must come yourself, or, be Jasus, I'll be after you to the ends of the earth." The head was withdrawn again, and the door once more slammed violently. Frank Curtis gave a hollow moan, thrust himself down in the bed, and drew the clothes over his face, as if to shut out some dreadful spectre from his sight. End of section 63.
Section 64 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Chapter 62. Frank's Embarrassments. Thus remained Mr. Frank Curtis for some minutes, each moment expecting that the bedroom door would again open, and that the voice of the terrible Irishman would once more convey some hideous menace to his ears. But Captain O'Blunderbuss had fairly departed this time, and at length the miserable young man slowly pushed down the clothes and glanced timidly round the room. It was no dream, as for an instant he had endeavoured to make himself believe that it was, for there was the chair in the very place where the captain had sat. There also was the bottle which the captain had condescended to empty. "A duel!" groaned Frank in a sepulchral voice. He who had fought so many in imagination. Then he remembered that there existed a means of averting all danger from himself, and, elated by the sudden thought, he leapt nimbly from his bed with the affectionate intention of proceeding forthwith to his uncle, and compelling the old gentleman to go forth and be shot at, whether by Captain Mordaunt or Captain O'Blunderbuss, Frank did not care a fig. Having hastily dressed himself, the young gentleman hurried off to Jermyn Street, and on his arrival he was surprised to find the knight's travelling carriage at the door, while the servants were busily employed in piling up portmanteaus and hat-boxes and band-boxes and carpet-bags. "Hallo!" cried Frank to Jeffreys, the groom, who was in the act of hoisting one of the aforesaid articles of luggage to another servant, who stood upon the roof of the vehicle. "What does all this mean?" "Means travelling, Mr. Frank," responded the domestic. "The order was given in a violent hurry, and so I haven't a moment to spare. But here's master and her ladyship." And sure enough, Sir Christopher and Lady Blunt made their appearance at that instant, the former enveloped in his great-coat and with a silk handkerchief tied round all the lower part of his face, and Charlotte muffled in a splendid cloak. "I say, Sir Christopher," cried Frank, "this won't do at any price, you know." "What won't do, sir?" demanded the knight in a stern tone. "Now then, Jeffreys, down with the steps." "Yes, sir," and the steps were lowered accordingly. Frank stood aghast as he saw the knight hand his better half into the carriage, and the said better half pouted up her really pretty mouth in a disdainful manner as she passed the forlorn youth. Sir Christopher was about to follow her into the vehicle, when Frank suddenly seized him by the skirts of his great-coat, exclaiming, "You shan't sneak off in this manner. You shall stay to—" "To what?" growled Sir Christopher, from the depths of the silk handkerchief which came up to his nose. "To be shot at," returned Frank, almost driven to desperation. The lady inside uttered a scream. Sir Christopher gave a desperate groan, and, breaking away from his nephew, rushed into the carriage. Jeffreys put up the steps and banged the door, and the vehicle rolled away, leaving Curtis standing alone on the pavement, the very picture of the most ludicrous despair. What was to be done now? The formidable Captain O'Blunderbuss held him, Yes, him, Frank Curtis, answerable for the appearance of Sir Christopher Blunt on the field of battle. Otherwise, but the alternative was too dreadful to think of. What then was to be done? Frank saw the impossibility of nerving himself so as to encounter the desperate fire-eater, and yet he knew that the captain would find him out, even if he removed his abode from the West End to West Smithfield. Yet something must be done, and that speedily, for it was now 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and next morning at 8 the captain would expect him at the place of appointment. An idea struck Frank. He would go and consult Mr. Howard, the attorney. To that gentleman's offices he accordingly repaired, composing himself by the way as well as he could, so as not to express by his countenance the alarms which agitated within his breast. Mr. Howard was disengaged, and gave him an immediate audience. "Well, I hope you're satisfied now that you hanged that poor fellow yesterday morning," said Frank, as he took the chair to which the solicitor pointed. "It was a duty which I owed to society," returned Howard, laconically, as if the subject were not altogether a pleasant one. "What an idea!" ejaculated Frank. "But, however, it is done, and can't be undone. After all, he was a brave fellow, a man just such as I could have admired, barring the highway part of his calling. And now you, who are such a stickler about duties to society and so on, suppose you heard, for instance, that a duel was going to take place between some friends of yours and another party. Of course you'd do all you could to stop it. You'd go to Bow Street, and you'd give private information concerning the Weir and the wind. Or perhaps you'd speak openly and get the persons bound over to keep the peace, eh?" "I should not do anything of the kind," answered Howard, who had already begun to suspect that Mr. Frank Curtis had some special reason of his own for speaking with so much earnestness—indeed, with such an air of appeal as he now displayed. "You wouldn't, eh?" exclaimed Frank, grievously disappointed at the ill success of his little manoeuvre. "And why not?" "Because I should only lose my time for nothing," responded Mr. Howard. "The devil! Then did you get Tom Rain hanged because the prosecution put money in your pocket?" demanded Frank. "Did you merely come to chatter with me, or on business?" asked the lawyer evasively. "If the former, I am busy. If the latter, make haste and explain yourself." "Well, the fact is," continued Frank, now feeling certain that the entire affair of Tom Rain's prosecution was a very sore subject with the lawyer, "the fact is, I wanted to speak to you about a little matter in which my precious old uncle has placed me in a complete fix. Not that I care about a duel, you know. I'd see a duel damned first before I'd care for it. Still you would rather not fight it," observed Mr. Howard with a slight curl of the lip. "You see, my dear fellow," proceeded Curtis, "that I have so many affairs of my own to attend to, I really cannot undertake to conduct those of other people. There's my marriage with Mrs. Goldberry coming off in a few days, and now, bother to it, up starts this duel business." "Do explain yourself, Frank," exclaimed Howard impatiently. "Well, I will, and in a few words, too. It seems that Captain Mordaunt has taken a tiff at my uncle's conduct towards his sister, and so he sends Captain O'Blunderbuss—" "Captain O'Blunderbuss, eh?" ejaculated the attorney, now becoming suddenly interested in the narrative of Mr. Curtis. "Yes, a terrible-looking wild Irishman," returned this young gentleman. "But he didn't frighten me, though." "I should think not. Do you know him?" "Only by name," answered Mr. Howard coolly, as he glanced at a suspicious-looking slip of parchment that lay upon his desk. "But go on." "Well, this old blunderbuss, it appears, goes to my uncle, who refers him to me, naturally enough, seeing that I am pretty well experienced in all matters of duelling," pursued Frank. "So the captain calls on me a couple of hours ago, and we discussed the business in a very friendly way. Everything is settled pleasantly enough, but before the captain takes his leave I catch hold of him by the button, and let him know that if he fails to produce his principal on the ground tomorrow morning, after all the trouble entailed on me, I shall hold him answerable accordingly. The captain looks rather glum at that, because I did tumble down upon him a little unexpectedly with my threat. However, he agrees, and we separate. But lo and behold, I go to Sir Christopher to tell him how comfortably I have settled the whole business for him, and he is gone, fled, bolted, mizzled, cut his stick, baggage and all, including his wife. And therefore," observed Howard coolly, "you will have to fight Captain O'Blunderbuss, because you will not be able to produce your principal." "It's just this that bothers me," exclaimed Frank. "If the man had offended me, I shouldn't, of course, mind. In that case, one of us should never quit the ground alive, for I'm a desperate fellow when once I am in earnest. But here's a poor devil who has never done me any injury, but who seems to me to be a capital hand at the whiskey bottle, and my fire-eating temper places us both in that position which compels him almost, poor creature, to insist on our exchanging shots. I really feel for the captain." "And not at all for yourself, Frank," said the lawyer in his usual quiet manner. "Oh, not an atom!" ejaculated Mr. Curtis. "But don't you admit that something ought to be done to prevent Captain O'Blunderbuss from becoming the victim of a display of temper so unjust and uncalled for on my own part? I wish to heaven my friend the Duke of the Tower Hamlets was in town. He would pretty soon put matters on a proper footing, and save me from the chance of killing a man that has never injured me. But his lordship the Marquis is not in town. Why, I must throw myself on your friendship." "Well, I will undertake to prevent the duel in this case," said Howard, speaking as quietly as if he believed every word of Mr. Frank Curtis's version of the affair. "Will you, though?" cried the young man, unable to conceal his joy. "I will indeed," returned Howard. "So make your mind perfectly at ease on that head. Where is the duel? Or rather, where ought it to take place?" "In Battersea Fields tomorrow morning at 8 precisely," answered Frank. "Very good," said the lawyer. "Now you must be with me at 7:15, here at my office, and I will have a chaise ready to take us there." "But need we go at all?" asked Frank, his countenance suddenly assuming a woeful expression again. "We must go to the field," replied the solicitor. "But trust me to settle the matter when we do get there. Again, I tell you not to make yourself uneasy. I will guarantee the complete settlement of the affair, and in a most peremptory manner, too." "Thank ye kindly," returned Frank, again reassured. "You have taken a load from my breast. Not that I care about fighting, you know, but it must be in a good cause." "That was just what I said when my best friend, the Prince of Scandinavia—" "There's enough of it for the present, Frank," interrupted the lawyer. "Leave the affair to me, and I shall manage it to your complete satisfaction. Be here at 7:15, not a minute later, tomorrow morning. And now you must permit me to attend to my own engagements." Frank Curtis took the hint and his leave accordingly, wondering how the lawyer would so manage matters as to subdue the terrible fire-eating propensities of the redoubtable Captain O'Blunderbuss. Nevertheless, the young man placed implicit reliance upon Mr. Howard's promise, and it was with a comparatively light heart that he sped towards the used dwelling of Mrs. Goldberry in Baker Street. End of section 64. Recording by Philip Gould.
Section 65 of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angela Olfest. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Section 65. Chapter 63. The Meeting in Battersea Fields. According to instructions given to his landlady, Mr. Frank Curtis was called at 5:45 on the morning following the incidents just related, and leaping from his warm bed, he proceeded, with quivering limbs and chattering teeth, to strike a light. Having, after a great deal of trouble, persuaded the short wick of his candle to catch the flame of the match which he held to it, he drew aside the window curtains and looked forth to ascertain the nature of the weather. The result of this survey was by no means reassuring, for a mizzling rain was falling, and a cheerless mist appeared to hang against the window. Frank closed the curtains again, and looked wistfully at the bed, as if he were more than half inclined to return to it, and leave Captain O'Blunderbuss to do his worst. But, on second thoughts, he knew that this was a hazardous venture, and accordingly he began to huddle on a portion of his garments. Then commenced the process of shaving, always an unpleasant one, but doubly so by candlelight, and when the hand is so nervous that the chances are equal whether you mow off the hirsute stubble or the tip of your nose. "Bother to this razor," cried Frank. "It won't cut at all this morning." The fault was not, however, in the razor, but with him who wielded it. At length, by dint of reiterated scraping, and steadying the right wrist with the left hand, Mr. Frank Curtis managed to achieve this portion of his toilette. When occupied with his ablutions, he thought that the water had never appeared so icy before, and his teeth chattered like a box of dominoes rattling. The fact was that the nearer the eventful moment approached, the more alarmed became this heroic young gentleman, lest the lawyer should disappoint him, or deceive himself, in the task of taming the formidable Captain O'Blunderbuss. It was 6:30 before Mr. Curtis quitted his bedroom, and he had just time to take a cup of coffee in his sitting apartment while the girl of the house ran to fetch a cab. She speedily returned with, or rather in, the vehicle. But when Mr. Curtis had taken her place, he perceived to his dismay that the horse had such an unpleasant knack of suddenly bolting round each corner he came to, and the driver was already so drunk, even at that early hour in the morning, that the chances were decidedly in favor of an upset. He, however, reached the lawyer's office in safety, though not before the clocks at the West End were striking 7. A hackney coach was already waiting at the door, and the moment Frank rang the office bell, Mr. Howard appeared. "Come, jump in, we have not a minute to lose," said the latter. Frank accordingly entered the coach, in which, to his surprise, he found 2 ill-looking, shabbily dressed fellows ensconced. Mr. Howard followed him. The door was closed hastily, and away rolled the vehicle in a westerly direction. Mr. Curtis was now enabled to examine at his ease, or rather at his leisure, for easy he was not, the 2 individuals just mentioned. One was a man of about 40, dressed in seedy black, and with a beard of at least 3 days' growth, and a shirt that seemed as if it had been worn and slept in too for a fortnight. His face was pale and cadaverous, and its expression sinister in the extreme. His companion was worse looking and dirtier still, but his countenance was red and bloated with intemperance. He carried a stout stick in his hand, and smelt awfully of rum. "Got your pistols, Frank?" inquired Mr. Howard, when the coach had moved off the pavement. "Pistols?" repeated the young gentleman, turning dreadfully pale. "I thought you... and his teeth chattered violently. "I know what I promised, and what I promised I will perform," responded the attorney. "But I thought you might like to make a show of an intention to fight before I interfered." "Oh, you know I never bully," exclaimed Frank. "If I made a show of fighting, as you call it, I would fight, and not pretend merely." "Well, just as you like," observed Howard. "We will settle the business the instant we get down there." "But is the gentleman sartain the captain'll be there?" asked the man with the stout stick and the red face. "Hold your tongue, Proggs," growled his companion in the shabby black. "These gentlemen know what they're up to." Silence then prevailed in the vehicle, and Frank Curtis sate wondering who the strange-looking twain could be. At last he came to the conclusion that they must be constables whom Mr. Howard had called into requisition for the laudable purpose of putting a stop to the duel. Still, such seedy constables were seldom seen. But then, reasoned Frank within himself, they might perhaps be in a state of insolvency, a suspicion certainly warranted by their outward appearance. The mist-like rain continued, and, though the morning grew a trifle brighter, it was in a very sickly manner. Frank had seldom felt more dispirited in his life, the weather leaguing itself with his own vague apprehensions to render him utterly miserable. At length the coach reached the vicinity of the Battersea Fields, and Mr. Howard pulled the check string as a signal for the driver to stop. He then descended. Frank Curtis followed, and the two queer-looking gentlemen alighted also. "You will keep at a decent distance, Mr. McGrab," said Howard, addressing himself to the individual in seedy black. "Very good, Sir Proggs," continued Mr. McGrab, turning to his companion. "You make a circumbendibus like, so as to cut off the captain's retreat down yonder. I'll skirt the river a short way, and then drop down on him." "All right," growled Mr. Proggs, and off he set in the direction indicated by his master, Mr. McGrab. Howard then took Frank's arm, and they walked on together, the young gentleman shivering and trembling violently. "What is the matter with you?" demanded the lawyer. "You shake just like an aspen." "Oh, nothing, nothing," returned Frank in a faltering tone. "Only it's very cold this morning, and this cursed mist. But there's the captain already," he suddenly ejaculated, making a full stop. Howard glanced in the same direction toward which Frank's eyes were turned, and beheld two individuals at a short distance. One, who was wrapped in a cloak and standing still, the other was pacing rapidly up and down in the immediate vicinity of his companion, and tossing his arms about as if in a perfect fury of indignation. "Come on," said the lawyer, dragging forward the terrified Frank Curtis. "There! The person who was walking up and down like a maniac has caught sight of us." "That's the captain," almost whimpered the young man. "Oh, my stars, how fierce he does look!" "Now then, ye shirkers, is it keeping us waiting, ye mane?" vociferated the terrible captain, sending his voice halfway across the field in a tone of awful indignation. "Be Jasus, it's a rale insult to me and my friend to be 7 minutes and a half behind time in this way." "We are coming, sir, as fast as we can," exclaimed Howard, "and may be a little faster than you will find to be agreeable." "My God, don't irritate him," implored Frank. "He's capable of shooting us both as we walk along. Don't be such a fool, Frank. You will see a rare bit of fun in a few minutes. Come along." And the lawyer dragged his shrinking companion forward. "Be the holy poker!" vociferated the captain, as Howard and Curtis now drew near enough for him plainly to recognize their countenances. "Be the holy poker!" he repeated, his eyes glaring furiously. "Sir Christopher is not here. Mortant, my dear friend, ye are swindled, robbed, plundered, cheated of the pleasure of a duel this cold morning. But I'll avenge ye, my boy, for I told that Mr. Curtis there that I'd hold him responsible." "Come, come, Captain," exclaimed Howard, as he and Frank now stopped at the distance of a few paces from the warlike officer and his friend Mordaunt. "Don't bluster or sputter in this fine fashion." "Is it bluster or putter to me, ye mane?" cried Captain O'Blunderbuss. "Be Jasus, sir, ye shall eat the words afore we're done. But I'll shoot Mr. Curtis first, and 'tis yourself I'll send headlong after him. Mordaunt, my friend, instead of being principal now, 'tis second ye must be. So give us the pistol case from under your cloak, man." "With all my heart, Captain," said Mordaunt, who was a tall, awkward gentleman, about 35 years of age, and as like Miss Julia as brother could be to sister. "Howard, my dear friend, my good fellow," gasped Frank Curtis in the ear of his companion, "is it possible that you've—" "Be Jasus, we're watched!" suddenly exclaimed the captain, whose quick eye now caught sight of a man approaching from the next field. "It is only my servant, sir, who is bringing my case of pistols," remarked Howard. "Not knowing whether you would be here, we kept them in the coach at a short distance." "Not be here!" repeated the captain. "Do ye take us for great cowards as old Sir Christopher Blunt? Be Jasus! But that man don't look like a servant anyhow. ejaculated the warlike gentleman, interrupting himself and fixing a ferocious look upon Mr. McGrab, who now came running up to the spot, completely out of breath. Howard glanced rapidly to the left and beheld Proggs approaching from that direction. "Here's another fellow!" exclaimed Mordaunt, who had marked and followed the lawyer's scrutinizing look. "Gentlemen, what does this mean?" "Yes, and be Jesus!" vociferated Captain O'Blunderbuss. "What does this mean? Have ye had recourse to the dirthy expedient of getting constables to come for'ard to spile the purtiest little affair that was ever to come off on a misty morning?" "I don't mean nothink of the kind, Captain," said Mr. McGrab gruffly. Then, as with a side glance he convinced himself that his follower Proggs was now only a few paces distant in the rear of the warlike Irishman, he continued thus: "The fact is, I'm a hofficer, and you're my prisoner." "An officer!" vociferated Captain O'Blunderbuss, his countenance becoming actually purple with rage, while Frank Curtis, suddenly assured that all prospects of a duel were at an end, began to enjoy the scene amazingly. "Yes, sir, this person is an officer," said Mr. Howard in the calmest manner possible, "and I am the attorney for the plaintiff, Mr. Spriggins, at whose suit you are now captured for £347, including costs." "Blood and thunder!" roared Captain O'Blunderbuss, swelling so tremendously with passion that he seemed as if about to burst through his military frock-coat with its frogs and braidings. "This is a rale insult, not only to me, but to also old Ireland. Mordaunt, my boy!" "It's a very awkward business, Captain," said the gentleman thus appealed to, "but I do not see why it should prevent the business on which we met. Pistols first, prison afterwards." "That won't do," said Mr. McGrab. "Not a bit," growled Proggs, who was now stationed close behind the captain. "Bastards of the earth!" roared O'Blunderbuss. "Do—" "Come now, enough of this gammon," interrupted McGrab. "If you won't walk quiet off with us, we must see what force will do." "It is no use to resist, my boy," whispered Mordaunt to his friend, who was literally foaming at the mouth. "But we will find another occasion to punish these cowardly fellows," he added aloud, casting fiery glances upon the lawyer and Frank Curtis. "Be Jesus! and I'll have some of it out of 'em now," ejaculated Captain O'Blunderbuss, and springing upon the unfortunate Frank, he administered to this young gentleman 3 or 4 hearty cuffs before a hand could be stretched out to withhold him. Curtis roared and wriggled about with the pain, but he was speedily released from the effects of this onslaught, McGrab, Proggs, and the lawyer hastening to his assistance. The warlike captain was then borne away to the hackney coach, in which he was safely deposited. Mordaunt, obtaining leave from Mr. Howard to accompany his friend in the same vehicle as far as the prison to which he was to be consigned, Frank Curtis declined forming one of the party, and while the coach proceeded in as direct a line as possible for Horsemonger Lane Gaol, the young gentleman sped merrily along alone and on foot, delighted, in spite of the drubbing in which he had received, to think that the redoubtable Captain O'Blunderbuss was on his way to a place where his warlike propensities stood every chance of being cribbed, cabined, and confined, at least for a season. You may conceive, gentle reader, that Captain O'Blunderbuss was in a dreadful rage at being interrupted in the midst of his favourite pursuit, especially as the interruption was of so unpleasant a nature as that described. But his vapouring and blustering produced little effect upon Messrs. McGrab and Proggs, who never spoke a word during the journey from Battersea Fields to Horsemonger Lane, save to answer in an affirmative when Mr. Howard proposed that they should stop at a public house for a few moments to partake of some refreshment, and then they each responded, "Yes, rum, please." The captain himself was accommodated with a glass of whisky. Mordaunt and the lawyer took nothing. The vehicle then proceeded without stopping to the prison, where the gallant captain, oh, most ignominious fate, was handed over to the care of the turnkeys in the debtors' department of the establishment. End of section 65. Recording by Angela Olfast.
Section 66 of The Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Old Death and his friend Tidmarsh. The incident which occupied the preceding chapter occurred, as will probably be recollected, on the morning of the Wednesday after the Monday on which Thomas Rainford was hanged and resuscitated. It was on the evening of the same Wednesday, and at about 8 o'clock, that we must again introduce the reader to the laboratory in Red Lion Street. A cheerful fire burnt in the grate, and before it sat Dr. Lascelles and the Earl of Ellingham, engaged in conversation, and also in the discussion of a very excellent bottle of claret, conveyed thither from the Earl's own cellar in Pall Mall. "I wish Jacob Smith would return," said the young nobleman, looking anxiously and nervously at his watch. "In the same manner you have renewed the conversation after every pause that has occurred during the last 2 hours," observed the physician. "My dear Arthur, there is nothing like patience in this world. You may depend upon it, all goes on well, or you would too soon have received the tidings of any evil that might have occurred. Bad news fly uncommonly fast." "I wish that I possessed a small amount of your calm and unexcitable temperament, doctor," returned the Earl. "But I am so fearful lest any untoward accident should mar the success, the complete success, of all our plans." "Do not meet evils half-way," said the doctor. "Everything has gone on well as yet. Mr. de Medina acted with the dispatch of a regular man of business. No one could possibly have managed better. He left on Monday evening for Dover, where he remained but just long enough yesterday morning to hire a cutter and arrange with the captain to have her in readiness to leave at a moment's warning. He was back in London again last night by 7, and fortunately your half-brother was so far recovered as to be able to depart in company with Jacob. The disguise you procured for him was impenetrable to even the eyes of the most experienced Bow Street runner. He and his young companion reached Dover early this morning, and I dare swear that long before this hour gallant Tom is safe in Calais, where Mr. de Medina and his daughters will also be some time tomorrow. Then off they all go to Paris, where you are to rejoin them." "Yes, all has been well arranged by Mr. de Medina," said the Earl, "and I have no doubt that the results will be as you anticipate. But I charged Jacob to return post-haste to London. I begged him not to spare the gold with which I furnished him, so that he might be back here as soon as possible to assure us of my brother's safe embarkation for France. And yet the lad is not with us yet. You must admit, doctor, that I am not to be blamed for my apprehensions, for misadventures and obstacles altogether unforeseen, never dreamt of indeed, do start up suddenly, that I confess I shall enjoy no peace of mind until I receive from Jacob's own lips the assurance that the object of my anxiety is beyond the reach of all danger." "How can it be otherwise than that he is already safe?" demanded the physician, somewhat impatiently. "Who can tell what may happen?" asked the Earl. "On Monday night, while Thomas was sleeping, and profound tranquillity as well as perfect security seemed to prevail in the house, was not the grand secret suddenly menaced by the appearance of one whom only a few hours previously I had been led to consider numbered with the dead? Yet doubtless you thought at the moment, while at your house in Grafton Street, that all was calm and unendangered in Red Lion Street."
The sudden turning up of that old scoundrel, whom Thomas Rainford supposed to be dead, and of whom you have since told me so much, was certainly very remarkable," observed the physician. "But you certainly managed the matter most cleverly, the more so too, inasmuch as my patient knew nothing of the transaction until it was all over." "Fortunately he slept, as I have already told you," said the Earl. "That excellent lad Jacob was for a few minutes completely overcome, stunned, stupefied indeed, when he recognised the countenance of Benjamin Bones; and I myself was strangely excited when those terrible words, "'Tis old Death," fell upon my ears, for I knew to whom they applied. Moreover, Jacob let the lamp fall, and I dared not move to obtain another light, for Bones began to struggle furiously. I was sadly alarmed lest my half-brother should awake, but fortunately his slumber was profound." "And then I believe Jacob Smith recovered himself and procured another light?" said the physician interrogatively. "You see, doctor," returned the Earl with a smile, "that you did not listen very attentively to my narrative of the transaction when you came back to the house yesterday morning, because I remember you would persist in telling me the story at a time when I was thinking of the best restoratives for my patient," answered Lascelles, also with a good-natured laugh. "But pray give me all the details now, and the occupation will while away the time until Jacob makes his appearance." "God grant that he may soon come!" exclaimed the Earl. "But let me resume at the point where we interrupted ourselves." "I asked you if Jacob did not procure another light the moment he had recovered his presence of mind," said the physician. "But I remember now that you availed yourself of the opportunity afforded by the darkness to drag the old man back to the staircase leading into the subterranean, and that the terrible menaces you whispered in his ears reduced him to the passiveness of a lamb. He is a hideous-looking man; for, after all you learnt from your brother concerning him, it is clear that he is the same whom I had seen in this house on 1 or 2 occasions, but whose name I did not then know." "He is clearly the same person," said the Earl. "Well, and so you got him down the break-neck stairs," added the doctor, "and then it was you called to Jacob to procure another light. Rainford continued asleep the whole time; but after all that had taken place in the morning, his slumber would necessarily be heavy." "I can assure you that a more dangerous task I had seldom undertaken than that of dragging the old villain down those stairs," said the Earl; "and how it was that we both escaped broken necks, I am at a loss to divine. However, I did get him safely down to the bottom, and the great door being then bolted only on the same side as the stairs, I had no difficulty in opening it. Jacob came down with the light, and I compelled the old man to rise and enter the subterranean with me. I will be bound his hideous countenance was convulsed with rage and alarm," exclaimed the doctor. "But I must get a cast of his head when he dies, which I dare say will be upon the scaffold." "Yes, he was positively horrible with mingled wrath and fear," continued the Earl; "but I had no pity for him, as I have none now. I made him walk a few paces in front of me, Jacob accompanying us with the light. Once he turned around and fixed on the lad a look so full of infernal spite, of demon-like malignity, that I was horrified to think that such hateful emotions could find an abode in the breast of any human being. Jacob Smith recoiled in affright, as if from the glare of a serpent's eyes; but I whispered a word to reassure him, and almost at the same moment I beheld, by the light of the lamp, a door in the side of the subterranean. You know the suspicions which had already filled my mind. They then returned, with renewed vigour to my memory, and I felt convinced that I touched on the threshold of a discovery. I commanded the old man to stop, suffering him to believe that I had pistols about me, and should not hesitate to use them in case of need. The door was speedily opened, and it led into the very dungeon where you were confined for 4 weeks, said Dr. Lascelles. The villains, the scoundrels who perpetrated such an outrage. Yes, it was the very same dungeon, continued the Earl, and my blood ran cold as I glanced within. Jacob Smith understood the discovery that I had made, and uttered an ejaculation of horror. I now know at least one of the authors of my imprisonment, I said, turning to Old Death, whose eyes were again glaring fiercely upon the lad. But, I added, this is no time for question and answer on that head. Then, taking the lamp, I held it in such a manner as to be able to throw its light upon that part of the cell where I had opened to myself the means of escape, and I perceived that the masonry had not been replaced. I accordingly resolved not to imprison the old man there. And yet what could I do with him? Turning round to examine more minutely the nature of the place, I beheld another door, on the opposite side of the subterranean. Old Death had marked the fact of my eyes lingering thereon, and he gave vent to something between a menace and a prayer. I seek not to harm you, was my reply, but as it once suited your purposes that I should become a captive here for a few weeks, it is now expedient, according to my views, that you should become a prisoner for a few days. In with you, old man, I added, having in the meantime opened the door of this second cell. And there the old reprobate is now cooped up, along with his friend Tidmarsh, exclaimed the physician, laughing at the idea of the 2 cronies being caught in one of their own snares. For that they were companions in iniquity, had now but little doubt. You must admit that the case was a desperate and an urgent one, continued the Earl. From all you had told me concerning this Tidmarsh, I felt well persuaded that he was likely to visit the subterranean, and I knew that, were such a casualty to ensue, Old Death had merely to raise his voice in order to obtain his release. And so you quit the subterranean and run round to Turnmill Street to tell old Tidmarsh that Dr. Lascelles wishes to see him immediately in his laboratory, exclaimed the doctor, again laughing heartily, for the entire affair seemed to have touched a long slumbering chord of merry humour in his breast. Precisely so, returned the young nobleman. Tidmarsh, however, eyed me very suspiciously, and muttered something to himself about the doctor being very indiscreet, but I affected not to notice his peculiarity of manner. He came round to the house, and you know the rest. Yes, you took him down to join his friend Old Death, as it seems the rascal is called, observed the doctor. And there they must remain until Jacob Smith shall have returned with the tidings of my brother's safe embarkation, continued the Earl. It is true that they are both utterly ignorant of his escape from death, his extraordinary resuscitation, thanks to your profound knowledge and generous aid, Doctor. But as we have every reason to believe at least one of them to be Thomas's enemy, they shall neither obtain a chance of discovering the secret of his new existence, as I may indeed term it. At all events, not until he shall be beyond the reach of danger. And do you know, it strikes me most forcibly that Tidmarsh was the gaoler who attended upon me during my incarceration in the dungeon below, although the person who was my gaoler invariably spoke in a feigned tone, and as laconically as possible. Yet I am almost certain that it was the voice of Tidmarsh. Moreover, he seemed for a moment so astounded, so struck, when I presented myself at the door of his dwelling in Turnmill Street, to deliver the forged message which induced him to accompany me round to his house, that I am convinced he knew me; for though he never permitted me to catch a glimpse of his countenance when he used to visit me at the trap in the dungeon door, still he might have seen my face. However, when I presented myself at his abode in the way which I have described, my manner appeared so off-hand and sincere, that had any suspicions of treachery entered his mind, they were dispelled almost immediately. But, doctor, I abominate the necessity of having to use duplicity, even towards villains of that stamp." "Your compunction is carried too far, my dear Arthur," returned Lascelles. "It was necessary to get that scoundrel Tidmarsh into such a snare as to place him beyond the possibility of doing mischief; and though the narrative which you have now given me more in detail than you did yesterday morning, when you hastily sketched these incidents to your brother and myself, though I say it makes me laugh, a habit not frequent with me, I really commend your foresight in averting danger, as well as your bravery in carrying into effect the requisite precautions." "I deserve and require no praise, doctor," answered the Earl. "What would I not have done to ensure the safety of him who has behaved so generously to me? During the whole of Monday night I sat by his bedside, anxiously awaiting the moment when slumber should leave his heavy eyelids, for I knew that I had welcome, most welcome tidings for his ears. But he slept on until you came, and then, doctor, you were a witness of the joy which he experienced on learning that he had not been the cause of the death of Benjamin Bones, miscreant though the man be." Scarcely were these words uttered, when a low but hasty knock at the front door caused Lord Ellingham to spring from his seat, seize the lamp, and hasten to answer the summons. Dr. Lascelles could hear the Earl ejaculate the words, "Jacob Smith!" Then a hurried whisper took place in the hall, and in another moment the joyous exclamation, "Thank God! Thank God!" bursting from the young nobleman's lips, met the physician's ears; and Dr. Lascelles thereby knew that Rainford had succeeded in quitting the shores of England in safety. Section 67
of the Mysteries of London, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysteries of London, Volume 3, by George W. M. Reynolds. Chapter 65. The Examination. The reader will remember that according to the arrangements originally chalked out, Lord Ellingham and Jacob Smith were to have accompanied Tom Rain to France. But this project was disturbed by the appearance of Old Death in the house in Red Lion Street, and the incidents to which it gave rise is narrated in the last chapter. For the Earl, having succeeded in making Old Death and Tidmarsh his prisoners, resolved to remain in the house not only that he might, by means of frequent visits to the subterranean, guard against their escape, but also to supply them with food and to liberate them when circumstances should render their farther confinement unnecessary. Thus it was that Tom Rain and Jacob had proceeded without the Earl to Dover, and that the lad had returned thence to London the moment he had seen Rainford safe on board the cutter which Mr. de Medina had hired especially to convey him to France. Nay, Jacob was not content with merely witnessing the embarkation of the individual to whom he had become so deeply attached, but, in spite of the instructions he had received alike from the Earl and Tom Rain himself, to return with the least possible delay to the metropolis, he had lingered on the pier at Dover until the white sails of the cutter were no longer in sight. He therefore arrived somewhat later in London than had been expected, although he travelled post and spared not the gold placed at his disposal to urge the postillions on. But when he frankly admitted to Lord Ellingham and the doctor the reason of his retarded appearance in Red Lion Street, they could not find it in their hearts to utter a word of reproach or blame. No, for Lord Ellingham's joy was now as exuberant as his apprehensions had a short time previously been strong and oppressive. and he wrung the hand of the humble Jacob as if that lad had been his own brother. "We will presently liberate our prisoners," said the Earl, when Jacob had related the particulars of his journey with Rainford to Dover, and of the latter's safe embarkation. "But before I suffer them to go at large, it behooves me not only to adopt the means requisite to elicit certain explanations interesting to myself, but also to take those steps that will effectually prevent the mysterious subterraneans and dungeons of this establishment, or rather of the two houses, from being accessible or available to the miscreants whom we are about to set free." Conceiving that Jacob would be sure to come back this evening, and intending that his return should be followed by the examination and liberation of those two men, I have ordered the 3 faithful domestics who assisted us so materially on Monday morning, and on whose fidelity I can rely with so much confidence, to be here at 9:30 o'clock. "For what purpose?" demanded the physician in astonishment. "To increase our numbers so as to overawe the wretches who are to appear before us," replied the Earl. "It is not that I fear to give them an inch of vantage ground, but were they to find themselves in the presence of only 2 men and this lad, they might attempt resistance, and use a violence that would alarm the neighbourhood. And I need hardly say, doctor, how necessary it is for all our sakes that we should not be placed in a position which would compel us to give to a magistrate any explanation of the modes in which we severally became acquainted with this establishment or those 2 vile men." "Your precautions are most admirably forecast, my dear Earl," responded Dr. Lascelles. "Hark! There is a single knock at the front door." "Run, Jacob, my boy," said the Earl. "My servants have arrived." The lad left the room without taking a light, but the young nobleman almost immediately rose and followed him, a second thought suggesting the prudence of assuring himself against the coming of any unwelcome intruder instead of his servants. By the time the Earl reached the middle of the stairs leading down into the hall, Jacob had opened the street door. "Mrs. Bunce!" exclaimed the lad, starting back half in affright as he recognised her wizen countenance by the feeble light that streamed from an adjacent window. "What! Jacob! You here?" cried the woman. "Why, how come you in this house? And what have you been doing with yourself lately? I began to think you was playing us false, but now that I find you here, I suppose you know all about the trick of Mr. Bones's pretended death, and have made everything right with him. But is he here?" "Yes," answered Jacob boldly, for he had by this time recovered his presence of mind. "Walk in. He wants very much to see you." "And so do I want to see him," added Mrs. Bunce as she entered the hall, while Jacob barred the door carefully. "I haven't seen him ever since Monday night, and he was to be sure and come up to the Dials last evening. So I got alarmed and come down to see. I went to Turnmill Street, but I could make no one hear there, for I suppose you know by this time all about Tidmarsh and the other crib." "Yes, and the subterranean too," added Jacob. "All the secrets so long kept from me are now revealed. But walk up, Mrs. Bunce, walk up." The woman, suspecting nothing wrong, and not altogether displeased to find, as she believed, that Jacob had risen so high in favour with Old Death as to become one of his confidants, the woman, we say, walked up the staircase, which was well known to her. But scarcely had she reached the first turn when she was suddenly grasped by a vigorous hand, and a voice exclaimed, "Make no noise, Mrs. Bunce, or it will be the worse for you." "Thank God you are there, my lord," cried Jacob, now hastily running up the stairs. "This woman is one of the gang which it has fallen to your lordship's lot to disperse." "Oh, Jacob!" ejaculated Mrs. Bunce, "you don't know what you are doing. But who is this lord, and what have I done to injure him?" "I am the Earl of Ellingham, woman," said Arthur, "and perhaps you are not ignorant of the long imprisonment which I endured in this place. But proceed. I will follow you, and remember that you are in the power of those who will not suffer you to escape." At that instant there was another knock at the door. "Remain here," said the nobleman to Mrs. Bunce. "Jacob, let me answer that summons." Arthur accordingly proceeded to the door and gave admittance to his 3 men servants. They then all repaired to the laboratory together, where the Earl made Dr. Lascelles acquainted in a hasty whisper with the cause of Mrs. Bunce's appearance on the stage of their present proceedings. The moment the woman emerged from the darkness of the landing outside to the light of the laboratory, she cast a hasty and inquiring glance around on those present, but her eyes settled on Jacob Smith, and she was evidently much astonished to see him dressed in a plain but most respectable manner, and looking neat, clean, and even interesting in his appearance. For the lad possessed good features, very bright eyes, and a set of white, even teeth, and though his countenance was still somewhat indicative of a sickly constitution, it nevertheless showed a state of health considerably improved by the excitement of travelling, and by the happiness imparted to his soul by the successful escape of Thomas Rainford. Jacob saw that Mrs. Bunce surveyed him with interest, and at the moment he felt pity for the woman who had on many occasions shown him some kindness, and towards whom he had also experienced at times unaccountable heart-yearnings. But he could not blame himself for having just now entrapped her into the power of Lord Ellingham, because he knew how important it was to assemble in the presence of that nobleman as many of Old Death's accomplices as possible. Besides, he was well aware that no harm was intended her, and this assurance he conveyed to her in a hasty whisper, though not in such a way as to induce her to believe that he was any longer an accomplice also. "You will now accompany me below," said the Earl, addressing himself to his 3 servants. Jacob hastened to light another lamp, of which there were several in the laboratory, and the Earl, attended by his domestics, proceeded into the adjoining bedroom, whence they passed down into the subterranean. Dr. Lascelles, Mrs. Bunce, and Jacob were left together in the laboratory. "What does all this mean?" demanded the woman, accosting the lad in an imploring manner, for she was afraid, in spite of the whispered assurance she had received from him. "I cannot give you any explanation," answered Jacob aloud, "but I may go so far as to promise you, and this good gentleman," he added, turning towards the doctor, "will confirm my words, that no harm is intended to you, provided you give faithful replies to the questions that will be put to you presently." "The lad speaks quite properly, woman," said the physician, "and you had better hold your tongue until the prisoners make their appearance." "The prisoners!" muttered Mrs. Bunce, and it struck her that the allusion must be made to Old Death and Tidmarsh. Nor was she mistaken, for in a few minutes the Earl and his domestics reappeared, escorting into the laboratory those 2 individuals whose hands were fastened by strong cords. Benjamin Bones looked more hideous than ever. A white bristling beard of 3 or 4 days' growth gave an additional death-like aspect to his countenance, and his eyes glared from beneath their shaggy brows with mingled rage and alarm. Tidmarsh manifested less emotion, but on entering the laboratory he cast a rapid and scrutinizing glance around as if to ascertain who were present. Old Death did the same, and when his eyes caught sight of Jacob Smith, his forehead contracted into 1,000 wrinkles with the intense ferocity of his malignant hate. Then he exchanged a rapid glance with Mrs. Bunce, who gave him to understand by a peculiarly significant look that she was not there as a witness against him, but as a prisoner herself. Dr. Lascelles stood with his back to the fire, contemplating the various persons assembled in a manner which showed that he was far from being an uninterested spectator of the proceedings. Indeed, he not only prepared to listen with attention to all that was about to be said, on account of the friendly feelings which he experienced toward the Earl of Ellingham, but he likewise occupied himself in studying the physiognomies of Old Death, Tidmarsh, and Mrs. Bunce, a survey which led him to the comfortable conclusion that if they did not all 3 perish on the scaffold sooner or later, it would not be their own fault. Lord Ellingham ordered the 3 prisoners to be accommodated with chairs, and when they were seated he addressed them in the following manner: "You are now in the presence of one who has the power to punish you for your numerous misdeeds, and who, should you refuse to answer the questions to be put to you, will not hesitate to hand you all 3 over into the grasp of justice. The individual who possesses that power, and who is now about to question you, is myself. All your secrets are known or suspected, and even should you refuse to answer my queries, or if you reply to them falsely, I have the means of arriving at the truth. To you, Benjamin Bones, do I address myself first. Answer me, then, and say wherefore your agents or accomplices waylaid me, and bore me off to that dungeon opening from the subterranean. Speak, villain, and see that you speak truly." "One word, my lord," said the arch miscreant, his sepulchral tones quivering and tremulous with mingled rage and alarm. "Let me say one word to you in private." "Not a syllable. Speak openly, and cause not idle delay," exclaimed the young nobleman. "Do you know," asked Old Death, "that it is in my power to publish a secret which would not redound to your honour?" "I can well divine to what you would allude," returned Arthur, "and I despise your menace. Go and say, if thou wilt, that the Earl of Ellingham is the half-brother of him—" "Who was hanged on Monday morning," growled Old Death, and then he chuckled horribly in the depth of his malignity. "Ha! ha! ha! The proud and wealthy Earl of Ellingham, the brother of a highwayman, who was hanged! And that brother, too, the elder one, and born in lawful wedlock! Ah, this would be a pretty tale to circulate at the West End. Scoundrel! You cannot provoke me to anger, said the Earl calmly, but you may move me to invoke the aid of justice to punish you for daring to imprison me during 4 long weeks in a noisome dungeon, a crime for which the penalty would be transportation for the remainder of your miserable life. Moreover, that same justice would require of you full and ample explanations respecting those rooms filled with property of immense value, and of such a miscellaneous nature that the various articles could not have been honestly obtained. Ah! You shrink, you recoil from that menace. Think you that any ridiculous punctilio has prevented me from forcing the locks of those rooms and examining their contents? No. The day after you became my prisoner here, and when I ascertained beyond all doubt that you were the tenant of those rooms, I hesitated not to visit them, to glean evidence against you. Now, old man, you see that you are in my power, and you will do well not to push my patience beyond the sphere of indulgence. And what if I tell you all you want to know? Said Benjamin Bones, appalled by the unveiling of the fearful precipice on which he stood. Give me the fullest and completest explanation of many circumstances in the unravelling of which I feel a special interest. Spare me the trouble of adopting other means to obtain the solution of those mysteries to which I possess a clue, exclaimed the Earl, and I shall forthwith liberate you and your companions, having previously taken measures to prevent you from holding any farther interest in this house, or the tenement in Turnmill Street, with which the subterranean passage communicates. And my property? Gasped Old Death. To allow you to retain it were a sin, answered the Earl emphatically. To give it up to the magisterial authorities, or to dispose of it for the benefit of the poor, would be to court an inquiry which must inevitably lead to the mention of your name, and the consequent apprehension of your person, a result which would be an indirect forfeiture of the promise I have given and now repeat, namely, to permit yourself and companions to depart with impunity on condition that you make a full and complete confession in regard to all the points wherein I am interested. What then can be done with that property? Exclaimed the nobleman. There is but one course to pursue, and that is to destroy it. Destroy it! Destroy it! Groaned Old Death, writhing with mental anguish on his chair. What! Destroy all that hard-earned wealth, those treasures? Every article, interrupted the nobleman emphatically, and consider yourself fortunate in quitting this house to breathe the air of liberty rather than be consigned to a jail. Oh, my God! Cried Old Death, reduced to despair by the lamentable prospect now placed before him. Blaspheme not, villain! Invoke not the sacred name of the Almighty! Ejaculated Arthur. Rather implore pardon for your manifold iniquities. It would take a long life of repentance to purge his soul of all the atrocity that harbours in it, observed the physician, who had intently watched all the variation of the old man's countenance during this colloquy. My dear doctor, said the Earl, there is hope for even those who are most deeply stained with sin. Yes, even for this miserable man who would sooner cling to his ill-gotten wealth than adopt the only means now open to him of avoiding the grasp of justice. But it is useless to prolong this discussion. Benjamin Bones, once for all, do you consent to make a full confession as the first atonement for a life of crime, and to surrender all your treasures as the second? Or shall I send forthwith to summon hither the officers of justice? But if you take mine all, you send me forth into the world a beggar, cried Old Death, in a tone which seemed to indicate that he was about to weep for very rage. On that night, said the Earl solemnly and almost sternly, when Thomas Rainford took from thy treasury the money which you conceive to be his due, did he not leave ample sums behind? And wilt thou tell me that thou hast not since disposed of those sums in other places of security? Thou seest, villain, that I can read all thy secrets, so prate no more about being reduced to beggary. Old Death's eyes fell beneath the fixed gaze of the Earl of Ellingham, who therefore perceived that the conjecture which he had just hazarded was indeed the right one. And will you let us go free if I answer all your questions? Said the arch miscreant after a brief pause, during which he consulted his companions in iniquity by means of a rapid interchange of glances. I will, replied the nobleman emphatically. But what if I should tell you more than you already seem to suspect, through ignorance of the precise extent of your real knowledge? Said Old Death, and thus make you acquainted with things likely to render you vindictive? I scorn a mean and petty vengeance, exclaimed the young nobleman. My word is pledged to a certain condition, and that promise shall be redeemed whatever the nature of your revelations may be. "Then I consent," exclaimed Old Death. "Bear witness, Dr. Lascelles, for you are an honourable man." "The Earl of Ellingham is too lenient," interrupted the physician. "But as it is, I guarantee my word of honour that his lordship will faithfully fulfil his promise." "In spite of anything that may transpire and for which he may not be prepared," added Old Death, determined to drive as sure a bargain as possible. "Because," he continued, "it is quite possible for me to foresee the nature of the questions you are going to put to me, my lord, and in answering them I may only commit myself. I am in your power, but pray use that power mercifully." "Mercifully!" cried the Earl in a tone of mingled scorn and disgust. "I have no sympathy with you of any kind, old man. You are loathsome to me. I merely make a compact with you, and that bargain shall be adhered to on my part if it be fulfilled on yours. I however warn you that should I detect you in aught at variance with the truth, our compact ceases, my promise is annulled, and you remain at my disposal as completely as if no pledge relative to your safety had ever issued from my lips." "Weigh well, then, the position in which you stand," continued the young nobleman sternly, "for I am not to be trifled with." "I will tell you all you require to know. All," responded Old Death, gasping convulsively. "Only let this scene end as soon as possible, for it does me harm." "We will proceed at once to business," said the Earl: then, seating himself in front of the prisoners, he addressed his questions to Old Death, saying, "In the first place, why was I imprisoned in the subterranean dungeon?" "To prevent you from using your wealth to bribe the gaol authorities to let Rainford escape, or your interest to save him if he was condemned," answered Old Death in a slow and measured tone. "Then, villain that you are," cried the Earl, scarcely able to subdue his resentment, "you had an interest in hurrying the son of your own half-sister Octavia to the scaffold." "Oh! I understand it all." Thomas felt assured that some profound, secret, and malign influence was at work against him; for those who were put forward as the prosecutors, the knight and his nephew, went as unwilling witnesses. "Then it was you," continued the nobleman in a tone of fearful excitement, "it was you whose gold doubtless bribed the attorney Howard to institute those fatal proceedings." "It was—it was!" ejaculated Old Death, trembling from head to foot. "But Rainford deserved it. He outraged me. I was good and kind to him. I threw excellent things in his way, but he made me bring him to this house. He learnt all my secrets. He robbed me of my treasures. He carried off my private papers——" "Silence!" exclaimed the Earl, in a tone which made the arch villain and his fellow prisoners, all three, start convulsively. "Give not a false colouring to that transaction. Rainford learnt, when in the country, who you were and how nearly you were allied to his late mother. He knew also how you had plundered him of his inheritance; and he was justified in the conduct he pursued towards you. The money which he took was legitimately his own, allowing for the accumulation of interest and compound interest, and the papers were not yours, but rightfully his property." "Then why did he not tell me who he was? Why did he entrap me and compel me at the muzzle of the levelled pistol to conduct him to my secret places?" demanded Old Death impatiently. "Your villainy and your craft could only be met by stratagem and counterplot," returned the Earl emphatically; "and in that way did Rainford meet you. And yet, for the truth of my assertion you cannot deny, you have sent your own nephew to the scaffold." "It was his own fault," persisted Old Death doggedly. "He should not have crossed my path. He should not have proclaimed warfare against me. I would have been his friend." "His friend!" exclaimed the Earl in a tone of bitter scorn. "Yes—his friend after his own fashion—in the way he wanted a friend," continued Old Death, becoming garrulous with nervous excitement. "But he outraged me in a way I could not forgive nor forget. He penetrated into all my secrets. He might have returned and helped himself again and again from my stores. He knew too much for me to be safe. And moreover, he bound me to a chair in such a way that I fell into a fit, and should have died had it not been for this man here," added the miscreant, indicating Tidmarsh. "All those things combined to render Rainford's death necessary, and he has paid the penalty of his conduct towards me." Lord Ellingham recoiled in horror from the fiend-like man who could thus seek to palliate the foul deed of having sent his own relative to the scaffold through no moral motives, but merely to gratify his vengeance and remove one who seemed to be dangerous in his path. "Let us know more of the sham death business on your part, Mr. Bones, or whatever your name is," said Dr. Lascelles. "You remember that night I came round to the house here and met you, sir," hastily exclaimed Tidmarsh, thinking he should serve himself by exhibiting a readiness to volunteer any explanation that was required. "Well, you recollect that it was the night you saw Rainford in your laboratory, and we knew that he had gone down into the subterranean. Then, if you please to remember, we went away together, and I took leave of you at the corner of Turnmill Street. But I suspected there was something wrong, although I did not dare offer to go into Mr. Bones's rooms while you were with me. As soon as you had left me, however, I returned to the house, not by the subterranean, be it well understood, and passing through your laboratory—" "Then you possess counterpart keys, rascal!" exclaimed the physician angrily. "But go on." "Well, sir, I passed through your laboratory into the bedroom there, locking the door of communication after me. Then I entered the first storeroom, but I had scarcely put foot therein when I heard a violent noise, as if some one was trying to break through the trap door in the bedchamber. I confess that I was frightened, because I knew it must be Rainford, and I suspected him to be a desperate man who meant no good in that house. I remained quite still, heard him break open the trap and come forth. I also heard him dash open the door of your laboratory, through which he passed. But as I had neglected to lock the other door there leading to the landing, he was not compelled to force that also. Well, I waited a few minutes till I thought he had left the house, then, having great misgivings on account of Mr. Bones, I went into the next storeroom. But there I caught a glimpse of Rainford standing over Mr. Bones, who was tied in his chair. I was about to retreat, I must confess, but Rainford bolted away like a ghost, and I ran up to my friend, who I thought was dead. I, however, saw enough at a second glance to convince me that he was only in a kind of trance-like fit, and in a short time I recovered him. That's my part of the story, sir, and I hope—" "Enough!" exclaimed Lord Ellingham abruptly. "I have now a question to ask you, Mr. Tidmarsh. Were you not my gaoler when I was a prisoner in the subterranean?" "Well, my lord, it's no use denying it," answered the man. "But spare your comments. I cannot complain of the way in which you executed a task doubtless imposed on you by your master here. Moreover, you even showed me some indulgence by permitting me to write those letters to my friends." "Give my friend Bones his due, my lord," interrupted Tidmarsh, "for I showed 'em to him first, before I posted them." "And as they could do no harm, I let them go," hastily exclaimed Old Death, "for I did not want to punish you more than I could help. Besides, I was glad you wrote them, in the first place because they prevented any noise amongst your friends on account of your disappearance, and secondly because the one you wrote to Rainford was enough to convince him he had nothing more to hope from you. Even while you seek to conciliate me, you cannot prevent the manifestation of your fiendish hate against him who was the son of your sister Octavia," said the Earl, gazing upon Old Death in profound surprise that his heart could be so irredeemably black. "But now answer me another question," he continued after a few moments' pause. "How came you to know that I was likely to use my interest or my gold on behalf of Thomas Rainford?" "My spies were stationed about Horsemonger Lane Gaol," answered Old Death, "and I had a lodging in the immediate neighbourhood. They came and told me that you had just gone into the prison to see Rainford, and I concluded that you must already be aware of the relationship which existed between you. To resolve and to act with me are the same thing, and I sent back my men to seize you and convey you to the subterranean." "And why had you stationed spies about the gaol?" demanded the Earl. "Because I suspected that Rainford would send for you, or that you would go to him of your own accord," replied Old Death. "For he had taken from me the papers which proved who he was, and I supposed that his first act on possessing them must have been to communicate with you, and in that I cannot have been far wrong." By dint of questioning and cross-questioning, the following additional facts were elicited. When Tidmarsh recovered Old Death from the species of trance or fit into which he had fallen when bound to the chair, the latter determined to encompass at least the transportation, if not the execution, of Tom Rain. For 2 or 3 days he remained quiet at Tidmarsh's abode in Turnmill Street, brooding over his scheme of vengeance, and communicating with none of his friends elsewhere—not even with the Bunces. In planning the punishment of Tom Rain, Old Death knew that he had a most delicate and difficult game to play, for the highwayman was to be sacrificed to his hatred and his interests, and yet in such a manner that the victim should not know by whom the blow was struck nor the source whence his ruin came. The deed must be effected with so much dark mystery that Rainford should not even have any ground for supposing that Bones was the real prime mover of the prosecution. and in this case the arch-villain felt convinced that Rainford would not even mention his name nor allude to his establishments in Clerkenwell, when placed before the magistrate or on his trial. The affair of Sir Christopher Blunt's £3000 seems the best point on which to set the whole of this complicated machinery in motion, and Old Death knew sufficient of Mr. Howard's cold, calculating, and money-making disposition to be well aware that his aid in the business could be readily secured. He communicated all his plans to Tidmarsh, and this latter individual suggested that Rainford should be led to believe that Old Death was no more. "For," said Tidmarsh, "when I entered your storeroom and saw Rainford gazing at you in your fit, I concluded you were really dead, and I am certain that such was the impression of the highwayman. Besides, he fled in horror, and Rainford is not the person thus to act save under extraordinary circumstances." This hint was adopted, and it was resolved that Rainford should be induced to suppose that Benjamin Bones was positively defunct, a belief that would of course preclude the possibility of any suspicion that the said Bones was the individual who set in motion the springs of that conspiracy which was to carry the victim to the scaffold. These projects being all settled between Old Death and his man Tidmarsh, the latter was dispatched to Mrs. Bunce, to whom the entire scheme was communicated. She was instructed to set spies to watch Tom Rain, and to convey to him if possible the information that Benjamin Bones was dead. It was also determined not to trust Jacob Smith with the plan of vengeance to be carried out, but as a precaution on the right side, to let even him also believe that Old Death was no more. At the same time the lad was to be used as a spy on Rainford, his devotion to whom was not of course suspected. When Mrs. Bunce met, or rather overtook, Rainford in Gray's Inn Lane on the Saturday night previous to his arrest, it was really by accident, and she availed herself of that opportunity to inform him that Old Death had gone to his last account, according to the instructions communicated to her in the morning of that very day. She endeavoured to watch whither Rainford went after she parted from him, but he disappeared, and she concluded that he had entered some house in that vicinity. That he had quitted Lock's Fields was known to her, and she therefore imagined that his new domicile must be in the lane. Jacob was accordingly set to watch that neighbourhood, but he misled her purposely, as will be remembered, by stating that he had knocked at every house in the street, and had ascertained that no such person as Rainford lived there. Tom was, however, seen by one of the spies in Piccadilly on the ensuing Sunday evening, as he was returning from Lady Hatfield's house, and he was dogged over to his old abode in Lock's Fields. In the meantime Tidmarsh had been to Mr. Howard, whom he bribed heavily with gold supplied by Old Death for the purpose,